And thanks to the foundation for this invitation. It's really an honor to be here. I want to start off. I was asked to speak very globally, broadly about democracy, and I want to start off by taking a slightly different take on the global state of democracy. So hear me out. I think global democracy has been surprisingly resilient in the 21st century. There is now a really broad consensus today that global democracy is in retreat. The well-known NGO Freedom House tells us that we've entered a period of global democratic recession and authoritarian resurgence. According to Freedom House, the world has experienced 16 consecutive years of democratic decline. Another leading democracy index, Varieties of Democracy, says we're in a period of global autocratization. That's a difficult word in English. I don't know about Portuguese. And VDEM just published a report entitled Democracy at Dusk. So very dark. But take a look at the actual numbers. Where do things stand? Where does the world stand after 16 consecutive years of democratic decline? According to VDEM's index, there were 93 democracies in the world 16 years ago. Today, there are 89 democracies in the world. That's a decline of 4 democracies. Freedom House shows a decline of 7 democracies. That is significant. But there are still more democracies in the world today than there were during the 1990s. According to VDEM, there were 40 democracies in the world in 1980. There were 60 democracies in the world in 1990 after the fall of the Berlin Wall. There were 87 democracies in the world in 2000. Today, there are 89. So we are still living in the most democratic period in history. Yes, democracy is broken down in Venezuela, in Thailand, in Nicaragua, in Turkey, and Hungary. There's been real backsliding in India, in Poland, in Serbia, in the Philippines, in El Salvador. But less attention is paid to the fact that Armenia, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Malawi, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Senegal, and the Gambia are more democratic today than they were a decade ago. In Latin America, Venezuela, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and to some extent Brazil are less democratic than they were a decade ago. But Ecuador, Bolivia, Honduras, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic are more democratic than they were a decade ago. And the level of democracy in Argentina, in Uruguay, in Chile, in Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama, Peru, Paraguay, and Guatemala has remained relatively stable over the last decade. So despite some backsliding, levels of global democracy have remained relatively stable, pretty much a flat line during the 21st century. Again, there were 87 democracies in the world in 2000. There are 89 today. To me, that suggests a remarkable degree of democratic resilience. Why do I say that? Why resilience? Remember, the 1990s and the early 2000s were a unique period in world history. They were one with unusually favorable conditions for democracy. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States and Western Europe became the world's dominant military, economic, and ideological power. And they used that power to actively promote democracy in many parts of the world. For about 15 years in the 1990s and early 2000s, democracy was the only game in town. Outside of China and the Middle East, there were really no legitimate alternatives to democracy. So the 1990s were a really hard time to be an autocrat. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, left-wing dictatorships lost their external patron. And because there was no more need to fight communism, anti-communist dictators lost their patrons in the West. So for a while, there were no counter-hegemonic powers to which dictators could turn for support. Russia was in a state of collapse, and China was just beginning to take off. So governments in the 1990s and early 2000s had to be on good terms with the West. And at the time, again, Western governments were pretty actively promoting democracy. It was during this period of Western liberal hegemony that democratization reached unprecedented levels. The number of democracies in the world more than doubled between 1985 and 2005. And in fact, democratization happened in totally unexpected places. Social scientists over the last half century have identified several factors that make democracy more likely to be born, more likely to survive. Industrialization, economic growth, a big middle class, a robust civil society, a dispersion of resources in society, low levels of inequality, a functioning state. But in the 1990s, democracy emerged in countries that had none of those conditions. Countries like Albania, Mongolia, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Benin, Mali. That's not because our theories were wrong. It's because the international environment was so favorable to democracy that it overwhelmed the effects of things like wealth, class structure, civil society, and economic performance. Now, over the last 15 years or so, global conditions have changed. The rise of China, together with Russia's resurgence as an aggressive anti-liberal power, has altered the geopolitical balance of power, putting an end to that period of Western liberal hegemony. So autocrats across the globe now have external patrons again. At the same time, a series of events has eroded the power, the prestige, the self-confidence of the liberal West. The Iraq War, the 2008-2009 financial crisis, Brexit, Trump. So the days when the United States and Europe were the world's dominant military, economic, and ideological power, those days are over. And as a result, liberal Western-style democracy is no longer the only game in town. Aspiring autocrats across the world no longer fear international isolation because they can turn to China, to Russia, to other powers. Western powers have also stopped promoting democracy abroad. The Trump administration reverted back to the old US strategy of embracing dictators, and the EU, which promoted democracy so successfully in Central Europe in the 1990s, did very little to defend democracy in Hungary, Poland, and Serbia. My point is that the international environment is far less favorable to democracy today than it was back in the 1990s. The global balance of power has shifted against the West, and Western democratizing pressure has largely disappeared. Those changes have pretty dramatically expanded autocrats' room for maneuver. It is simply a lot easier to be a dictator today than it was 30, 35 years ago. Given that change, given this increasingly unfavorable international environment, the fact that there are still 89 democracies in the world today suggests a fair amount of democratic resilience. And I think three factors help to explain that resilience. First of all, the liberal West may be down, but it is not out. The United States and Europe remain powerful militarily, economically, ideologically, and in much of the world, Western powers continue to be more attractive partners than Russia or China. So Western influence has weakened a lot, but it hasn't disappeared entirely. Secondly, and importantly, we have yet to see the emergence of a broadly legitimate alternative to democracy. Unlike the 1920s and 30s, when fascism and communism emerged as a legitimate alternative, popular alternatives to liberal democracy, today's alternatives still have relatively little appeal. There is no Russian model that activists in Europe or Latin America are trying to emulate. Chavez's effort to create a Bolivarian model have failed. Nobody in Latin America wants to be like Venezuela anymore. Many aspiring autocrats would love to replicate the Chinese model, but that's really hard to do. China's regime was born out of a violent social revolution. And nobody in Latin America is taking to the streets to demand single-party rule. So the liberal democracy may not be the only game in town anymore. For most Latin Americans, it's still the least bad alternative, the mal menor, as we say in Spanish. Latin Americans may pretty intensely dislike their politicians. They may distrust their country's political institutions, but they like competitive elections. They like being able to vote out governments that they don't like. No other regime type on earth gives people that option. That's why democratic backsliders like Peru in the 1990s, or Bolivia, Ecuador, Honduras in the early 2000s eventually slid back into democracy. That brings me to my third point. Many of the world's new autocracies are just as fragile as new democracies. Autocratic governments in the world face the same problem or same set of problems as new democracies. They face corruption, rising crime, poor public services, widespread unemployment. And when they fail to deliver, they often face widespread public discontent. So new and aspiring autocrats have fallen from power in the last few years in Armenia, in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Gambia, in Malawi, in Malaysia, in Sri Lanka. In Latin America, they fell in Bolivia, in Ecuador, and Honduras. So competitive elections continue to persist and remain pretty robust in Latin America. That's the end of the optimistic part of the talk. Doesn't mean that the persistence of competitive elections, which is really important, doesn't mean that all is well. All is not well. Autocrats often come to power through elections, and this is something we're seeing with a growing frequency in Latin America. We saw it with Fujimori, with Chavez, with Correa, with Bukele, with maybe Bolsonaro. Now, most of these guys that I just mentioned are populists. They are political outsiders who mobilize subaltern groups from above against the entire political establishment. Populism is a fundamentally anti-elite phenomenon. Populists attack traditional parties, attack traditional politicians as corrupt, as oligarchic, as unrepresentative, and they promise to sweep them away in the name of a more authentic democracy. Populist presidents almost always pose a threat to democracy for a couple of reasons. First of all, populists tend to be political outsiders, and outsiders very often lack a strong commitment to the institutions of liberal democracy. Whatever you may think of professional politicians, most of them are committed to working within democratic institutions. They are experienced with the nuts and bolts of democratic politics, things like negotiation, coalition building. They know how to get bills through Congress. They know how to deal with the media. They know how to work the courts. So at the end of the day, professional politicians tend to respect those institutions. They know how to work those institutions, and really those institutions are their livelihood because they are professional politicians. Outsiders are a different story. They've got less experience with democratic institutions. They often lack the skills to deal effectively with opposition, with the media, to build and sustain political coalitions, or to succeed in the give and take of legislative politics. And many of them lack the patience for those things as well. But the biggest problem with populists, above all, is how they get elected. It's how populists get elected. Populists invariably campaign on a pledge to destroy what they depict as a corrupt and unrepresentative system. Sweeping away the existing elite, sweeping away the existing elite's institutions is a pretty radical mandate, but it's what these guys are elected to do. The problem is that the old system that populists rail against is usually some form of democracy, and the corrupt and unrepresentative institutions that populists promise to sweep away are things like political parties, legislatures, Supreme Courts. And in fact, when populists win the presidency, when they win the power, they very often find that the old elite they've been campaigning against controls these other institutions. The traditional parties often still have a majority in Congress. Their appointees still sit on the Supreme Court or other the electoral agencies. In many cases, the old parties wrote the existing political rules of the game. For a political outsider who was elected on a promise to bury the old elite, to then sit down and negotiate with that elite, to build coalitions with that elite, to govern with that elite, that is a betrayal of your electoral mandate. And betraying your electoral mandate can be politically very costly. So populist presidents have a political incentive to assault democratic institutions, to try to circumvent Congress, to try to pack the court, to maybe even rewrite the Constitution. That's a recipe for constitutional crisis. It's a recipe for a showdown between a popular president who's promised to sweep away corrupt and unrepresentative institutions and a political elite that views those institutions as their last bastion of defense. Populists very often win that confrontation because when a newly elected populist president takes on the old political elite, public opinion tends to overwhelmingly favor the populist. And when populist presidents prevail in those conflicts with the old political elite, they can usually concentrate a lot of power. They can close Congress and elect a new one with a pro-government majority. They can pack the courts and pack the electoral authorities. They can rewrite the Constitution to concentrate power and weaken their opponents. We saw this back in Perón's time in 1940s in Argentina. We saw it in Peru under Fujimori. We saw it in Venezuela under Chavez. We saw it in Ecuador under Correa. We're seeing it today in El Salvador under Bukele. Populism is not the only way that democracies die, but it is becoming the leading cause of death, especially in the Americas. Now, populism is obviously not a new thing in Latin America, but it is becoming more prevalent. Think about the elections just in the last few years in Latin America. Just about every election in Latin America in the last 4 years, at least one, if not both, of the major contenders might be labeled an anti-system outsider. Start with Brazil with Bolsonaro in 2018, El Salvador with Bukele, Mexico with AMLO, Chile with both Boric and Kast, Peru with Castillo, Costa Rica with Rodrigo Chavez, Colombia recently with Petro and Hernandez in the second round. Argentina next year, we may see the rise of Milei. Now, not all these guys I just mentioned are full-blown populists. Not all of them are going to assault democracy, but the pattern is pretty clear. Outsiders are beating insiders today in Latin America, and most of those outsiders are winning with an anti-establishment discourse. If history is any guide, we are likely to see more democratic crises as a result of that. So the question is, why are so many populist outsiders getting elected? There is a supply side and a demand side answer to that question. The vast majority of observers focus on the demand side. They ask why Latin American voters are increasingly turning to anti-system candidates. It's an important question. Public discontent in Latin America has a bunch of causes. One of them is social inequality. For voters to back a populist outsider who promises to destroy the entire elite, there has to be a hell of a gap between the elite and everyday citizens. But the most important driver of public discontent in Latin America, I want to suggest anyway, is state weakness. If you want to understand why Latin American voters get so angry at politicians, angry enough to throw them out in favor of a clown or a priest or a general or a total unknown, you have to look at state capacity. And by state capacity, I mean the state's ability or inability to carry out basic tasks, collect taxes, build roads and schools, implement social programs, provide public security. When states are weak, it is almost impossible for governments to govern well, no matter how honest they are, no matter how well-intentioned they are, no matter how well-trained they are. Where states cannot tax, where they can't get bureaucrats to do what they want them to do, where they can't systematically enforce the rule of law, even the best-intentioned governments will not be able to deliver the goods. They won't be able to pave roads, to maintain schools and hospitals, to control corruption, to provide basic security to their citizens. And when governments consistently fail to deliver the goods, public discontent inevitably rises. Governments come to be widely perceived as indifferent, as incompetent, as corrupt. And when that perception persists over time, from one government to the next government to a third government, citizens start to conclude that all the political parties are the same, that all politicians are corrupt or no good, and that nobody in the political class represents them. It is those citizens who are most likely to vote for political outsiders who promise to throw everybody out. Now, if you add to that the end of the commodities boom, add to that the pandemic, add to that the rise in violent crime, you can understand why so many Latin Americans are voting against the status quo. But with the exception of COVID, none of that stuff is new in Latin America. Weak states and public discontent, social inequality are endemic to much of the region. I want to suggest that what's really new in Latin America is not so much the demand for populism, it's the supply. It's the supply side of populism. It is simply much easier to be a populist today than it was 40 or 50 years ago. And the reason is, I want to suggest, that political establishments are weakening across the globe. What the hell do I mean by that? By political establishment, I mean the network of individuals and organizations that control the resources that politicians need to get elected. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to focus on three types of establishment organization, three types of establishment actor. One of them is political parties. Parties are important to politicians because they nominate candidates for public office. Where parties are strong, where parties dominate, their control over the candidate selection process allows them to serve as political gatekeepers, filtering out anti-system outsiders. So parties is one. Second type of establishment organization is major interest groups, business associations, labor unions. Interest groups are a major source of finance and other campaign resources. Candidates everywhere need resources. They need money. They need activists, people to put up flyers and posters. Historically, business and labor in many democracies have provided the bulk of those resources. Third type of establishment actor is major media outlets, particularly major TV networks and newspapers. Access to the media is obviously critical, essential to candidates' ability to reach voters. Without access to the media, most political parties, most candidates cannot achieve the name recognition necessary to win elections. You've got to be able to get your name out to voters. Now, the establishment is not a monolithic actor. I'm not Noam Chomsky. Political parties, nobody's laughing. Political parties, interest groups, media outlets do not constitute, they're not a monolithic block with a single set of interests. There is always pluralism, there is always competition within the establishment. But collectively, establishments do tend to impose certain parameters on politics, both in terms of political style and in terms of policy substance. So there are certain norms that govern how politicians are supposed to behave, how they dress, what they say, how they treat one another, how they treat the media. There are also policy positions when the establishment is strong that are considered beyond the pale, and politicians who exceed those boundaries, who violate certain behavioral norms, who push certain extremist policies, they get shunned by the establishment. They become pariahs. That means that party leaders will not nominate them. It means that leading business associations, unions, and other interest groups will not contribute to their campaigns. It means that the mainstream media will not cover them, or their coverage will be systematically negative. Now, if you go back 50 years, that mattered a lot. Being shunned by the establishment during the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s mattered because establishments had a monopoly over the resources politicians needed to get elected. Party leaders, going back 50 years, controlled the candidate selection process. There were no primaries. So if you were not on good terms with party bosses, you could not run for office. A relatively small number of interest groups 50 years ago provided the vast bulk of campaign finance, business, labor unions. If you were shunned by big donors, you could not raise money. Finally, of course, 50 years ago, a small number of major media outlets dominated the media scene. There were 2 or 3 major TV networks, a handful of influential newspapers. If the New York Times, the BBC, or Global decided that you were unfit for office, you were shut out. You were done. The fact that established political parties, interest groups, and media outlets monopolized access to resources, to the resources that politicians needed to get elected, meant that politicians 50 or 60 years ago had to be on good terms with the establishment. Politicians needed the approval of party leaders to run for office. They needed the approval of major interest groups to fund their campaigns. They needed the approval of major media outlets in order to reach voters. That dependence of politicians on the establishment had important consequences for democracy. 20th century politicians couldn't just respond to voters. They couldn't just give the people what they want. Instead, they had to strike a balance between appealing to voters on the one hand and remaining acceptable to the establishment on the other hand. That had a moderating effect on politics because it kept the most extreme politicians and many of the most extreme issues off the agenda. Now, that was not very democratic, but for better or worse, that's how 20th century democracy worked. It was a system, in effect, of elite competition. But the days of establishment monopoly are over. Establishments across the globe, Europe, Latin America, United States, have lost their control over essential electoral resources, which means that they're losing their power, they're losing their influence over politicians. So in my country, in the United States, in the UK, established political parties no longer monopolize candidate selection. Interest groups have lost their monopoly over campaign finance because candidates can raise money online. Bernie freaking Sanders raised more money than Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden. And of course, social media has eroded the influence of established media. Today, Twitter, Facebook, other social media allow candidates to reach voters even if they're shunned by the mainstream media. I traveled to Sao Paulo 4 years ago, early in the 2018 presidential campaign, and I gave a fun talk at the Cardoso Foundation. I also spent a lot of time meeting with business leaders in Sao Paulo, nearly all of whom supported Alckmin. Even though Alckmin, this is July, I think, 2018, even though Alckmin was way behind in the polls, 4% of the polls, just about every business leader I talked to in Sao Paulo in the Brazilian winter of 2018 was convinced that Alckmin would win because he was backed by the Central, which had gave the support of the parties of the Central, gave Alckmin a huge advantage in free television time, right? Every night, Alckmin had an hour or something of free TV time, and Bolsonaro had 6 or 7 seconds each day. Nobody I talked to in 2018, and these were pretty smart individuals, nobody I talked to mentioned YouTube or WhatsApp. But that's what Bolsonaro used to bypass television networks and obviously win. Point is that politicians today do not need the establishment. They can raise money online. They can reach voters via Twitter and Facebook. They can hijack political parties through primaries like Trump, or they can just create their own parties like Fujimori, Correa, Bukele, and many others. Now, for politicians, this is liberating. They can now respond directly to voters without worrying what the establishment thinks. They can violate established norms. They can build a reputation as a maverick or an outsider who's no longer beholden to the elite and is willing to tell it like it is. They can say and do things that were previously off limits. Think about Trump. Think about Bolsonaro. In fact, candidates today can openly campaign against the establishment, which is actually a very good way to win votes. Again, there's always been a demand for populism in Latin America. What's really new is what's happening on the supply side. It is simply much easier to bypass the establishment than it was 50, 70, 100 years ago. When Perón beat the Argentine establishment in 1946, it took a miracle. It took the kind of mass mobilization that you only see once in a century. When Bukele beat the Salvadoran establishment in 2018, was not that hard. He just mobilized 2 million people on Facebook and Twitter. Pedro Castillo had the entire Peruvian establishment against him. And I mean entire establishment, business, media, political elite, all of Lima was lined up against him. Castillo had no party organization. He had no money. To be honest, he had no talent. And yet he still won. Now, this new scenario is much more democratic than the old one. Anybody can win the presidency today in Peru. Anyone can win the presidency today in the United States, maybe in Brazil. Peru's election last year may have been the most democratic election in the history of the world. A provincial nobody beat the entire Lima establishment. And because politicians no longer need the establishment, they can be more responsive to voters. They can give the voters what they want. But what happens? What happens when the people are so angry that what they want is somebody who will take a wrecking ball to Congress, to the Supreme Court, to other institutions of representative democracy? In other words, the weakening of the establishment opens the door to a bunch of new political actors. That's pretty democratic. But at the same time, it leaves democracies vulnerable to anti-system forces. And that can turn out to be authoritarian. This is a hell of a paradox. The weakening of political establishments is unquestionably democratizing, but that very democratization may now pose a threat to liberal democratic institutions. Go back to the 18th and 19th century, elites were terrified of democracy. They hated democracy, and they hated it because they equated democracy with rule by the people. Western elites did not really accept democracy as we know it until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, about a century ago, a little more. And one of the things that made democracy acceptable to Western elites was the protective power of political establishments. 19th and 20th century establishments imposed powerful constraints on democratic competition. They transformed what could have been a highly plebiscitary, majoritarian politics into a more bounded, elite-centered competition. But the days of elite democracy are coming to an end. The establishment's gatekeeping powers have eroded, and it's hard, at least for me, to see that process reversing. I think it's going to continue. So we're very likely to see more Trumps, more Bolsonaros, more Bukeles. How our democracies will hold up in this new populist era, I think, is anybody's guess. Let me stop there. Thanks.